And just a little bit of history for those of you that might not know or want a refresher. This tree is one of the 3 compositions that came out of the lab project, which we started back in 2017, 18, I believe. This idea of providing an opportunity for bonsai artists, ceramic artists, and a stand maker to give them the chance to work on trees without the limitations of clients or of finances, to really help them explore and advance bonsai as an art form. And largely thanks to Millie, the process morphed into not just 1 composition, but 3 compositions when we started to question the sequence that we make bonsai in, right? Typically, we start with the tree, it's styled, we find a container or have a commission that supports the tree and complements it, and then that dictates the size and shape of the stand that it sits on. But the idea was presented that, well, what if we started with the container, and then you had to find the tree that would work with that, and then we were off to the races with then starting with the stand and leading that process. And so this tree, though, kind of served as our control. Kind of when we think of an experiment, we need a control for consistency. This was the one that followed sort of the traditional sort of pathway of the tree pot stand design process. And so this limber pine was originally collected by Randy Knight, I believe back in 2015 or so, and came out of the Rocky Mountains. And when we were sourcing material for this project, I was able to go down to Morai and look at what they had to offer. And this tree was laying flat on the ground, hadn't been styled or anything like that, but this was one of the options that was in our price point. And we got it and sort of forgot about how big it was. I have a picture of it, and when we look at it, it was like, oh yeah, it's really nice material. But then once we got it, it was really shocking how large this tree is when you sort of take it all in. It was styled back in 2018 at our very first lab session at the Chauncey Griggs house in Lakewood by Ryan and everyone who was in attendance there. I think Millie was one of the few, aside from staff, that was here. Anyone else besides our staff and Millie that were at the first lab? I don't think so. Anyway, it was really fascinating to see Ryan style this, and the design of it was different. He had this leaning to the right, and more of a traditional kind of presentation, and he chalked that up largely to the sort of pressure he felt from this event and trying to perform, and even commenting on the physical, the weight, the visual weight of this cantilevered roof that was above us, kind of like imposing over you. All of that sort of perceived pressure kind of made him go back to the safety of the traditional kind of Japanese styling of this tree, a little bit more symmetrical, rather than this really strong asymmetrical into this one side. There's a podcast we did that we kind of dissect and digest that process, and we basically went back and restyled it, or changed the styling, I should say, moved the tree over this. It hadn't been potted yet, to this side, which is much more dramatic and taking advantage of the hollow in the trunk, or the hollow in the dead wood, and this really strong, diagonal line coming off to the left and the floating branches. Ron then produced 2 containers. Back in 2019, we potted this tree. This one, this really clean, almost metallic-looking pot with the rivets on it, contrasting that really rough and rugged bark. Everyone in the room was really struck by that contrast. And Ron showcasing his skill set by creating a ceramic that actually was mimicking metal in a way. And so I had several people at the expo come up and ask, is that metal? And the guy next to him was like, oh yeah, I tapped it, it's metal. And I'm like, actually it's ceramic. And he was like, he looked at me like, what are you talking about? Anyway, for that factor, this idea of the materials that we were using was kind of became one of the themes, and that led to Austin's using of cement to create this stand, largely due to the fact that as this tree pot kind of emerged, we realized that we wanted something that we could display outside. And so his first stand is in the conservatory, that wooden, very tall, slender stand. That was the first one, and we wanted to be able to display them kind of as a package sort of in the display space. And so that led him to realize he could he needed to use something other than wood that would withstand the elements of our display area. And so he cast this out. He took a mold of an old tree stump near the Columbia River, and then used that, and then cast all of that as a unit into this large stand. So there's rebar and the steel kind of like chicken wire in there, and he basically constructed this, much like building a home or something like that. And so again, the theme of architecture playing a component with the cement, the metal, and then the last thing was the idea of glass, and that really came about through Courtney Branam. It was interesting. We were looking at when we were working on this up until recently. Courtney had sent me a message before he worked here. He's been working here for over 2 years now, and this was even before that, kind of when we were in the early stages of the lab project. And he said, "Hey, I'm Courtney. I'm the guy with the beard. I blow glass. Like, I would love to, work with the lab project, and just sort of express that interest." Which fast forward several years later, and we actually got to do that. So him and I have been chatting off and on over his course of him working here, just about how do we use glass and what are the options, and just having some good lunchtime discussions about it. And so he really kind of pushed me to be like, hey, we could do something if you wanted to. I could reach out to Mog and leverage my contacts, and we could actually make this a thing if you wanted to do that. And so we were thinking about how do we incorporate glass. When you look at this tree without the bubble or the glass underneath it, the visual weight, the mass of this tree with the concrete and then the pot and the tree, it's such a visually heavy tree, right? To have something contrasting it with the lightness and fragility of glass really seemed like something you could use to accentuate that tension that we're seeing in the asymmetry of this sort of negative space under this branch, right? This tree is very exaggerated in its lean, and it feels like it could fall over. And so again, the contrasting of heaviness and lightness, of fragility and kind of strength, and then also from a materials standpoint, the materials really became the focus of this composition, where we kind of see the smoothness of the pot, the roughness of the stand, the smoothness of the glass, and then the roughness of the tree, kind of this kind of alternating rough, smooth, really kind of allowed these materials to represent something other than what they were, right? Ceramic representing metal, concrete representing wood, and then glass coming in and sort of representing, I would say, probably water, or also playing around with light. And someone provided a really interesting feedback when they saw this, and we weren't necessarily intending it, but I'm interested to hear two people's impressions of it, is that the blue glass at the bottom kind of evoked the idea of when we water the tree, we kind of have the water dripping out of the bottom. And so for him, it spoke to that. But yeah, Courtney, do you want to talk a little bit just about the thoughts behind, or maybe explaining the technical challenge of creating that? Because I know I definitely didn't have a sense of appreciating what goes into creating something that looks fairly simple from a form, but is far from it from a technical standpoint. Can you talk to that a little bit?
Yeah, so for a lot of you who maybe you don't know, before I worked here, I was a full-time glass builder, freelancer, and working at the Museum of Glass is one of my main gigs. And one of the things we do there is we work with artists who don't necessarily work with glass, helping them kind of realize their vision with the materials, so we become their hands, almost like a studio band. And so when I started working with Aarin and we started having these discussions, it's a true collaboration here. Like, this isn't my work. I don't feel ownership over this, and it's very different from the stuff that I make for myself. So I would never claim like, oh, this put my signature on this. This is it's almost an exquisite corpse kind of a thing. Aarin is as much involved as I was. And so I was able to kind of take the skills and bring it to the Museum of Glass team, and with this idea of kind of like, here, this is what we want to do, but also realizing like the scale of it is pretty intimidating. So this the large glass bubble in particular, when it was originally made, it was probably twice as big as it is now. We had to cut it down to make sure it could fit into under the table there. And so the team at the Museum of Glass is all professional glass blowers. Everyone has 15 to 20 years experience working with material, and they've been working as a team for going on 15, 20 years since the museum opened. So I kind of knew, I was like, well, if anyone can pull this off, it's going to be these guys, you guys. And so I brought a kind of proposal, informal proposal, and gave them some measurements, and they said, yeah, we think we can do it. And we kind of went into it knowing that it might not work. This might just be all for show. So we had 4 attempts, and we actually did 3 attempts, and we got 1 that survived. And Ben Cobb, who's the lead glassblower at the museum, my proposal, I said, let's just 3 tries, we'll get what we get. I don't want anyone to get hurt.
Why would that happen? Explain why you get hurt.
Just because of there's about 45 pounds of glass on the end of a blowpipe, and the glass is hot, it's moving, it's putting off an enormous amount of heat. It's 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit. The torque of keeping the glass moving the whole time, reheating it, bringing it, inflating it, it takes a significant coordination amongst the team. It took 3 of us to lift the bubble to the reheating chamber and bringing it back to the bin. So every time we reheated the glass, 3 of us would have to, 2 people, 1 person holding the blowpipe, 2 people holding the glass bar. And you only get a couple minutes to work on the glass, and it needs to be reheated. And so knowing that, you kind of have to be careful. There's a lot of stress on your body doing this. And so, like I said, the proposal was 3 shots. That's all we're going to get. And we got the 1 good one, and Ben said, he's like, I got 1 more in me. Let's do it. So 1 more, and I think we got the good one out of that 4th one. And then, some of the other elements were kind of almost an afterthought, because Aaron and I have been kind of brainstorming of like, well, what are some of the other things we could do with glass other than just this inflated bubble? And with the lab project, we kind of, recognizing like these materials, referencing other materials, and it's like, well, glass can represent water. I kind of had an idea of like this trick, I guess, or technique for making these ripple plates, and I was like, it'd be perfect. So we made a couple of those, and then we kind of brought them back here, and Aarin kind of saw it, and we started putting things together, and he put this on the inside, and I said, well, let's get a mirror in there, let's get some more light reflecting and bounce it around. And I think that the combination of all those elements together really brought the composition to another level, whereas if it had just been that clear bubble, maybe it's impressive, but I don't know, I think we really
We took it down to the expo and, and worked with a Bay Area artist as well to kind of have that another hanging element, kind of really frame it in the space, because we were in a very large industrial warehouse down in Oakland, and due to the size of that, this tree kind of by itself, because this one wasn't put into the general show, it was off by itself as kind of a standalone avant-garde offering, and that was something we were chatting with the producers about, was wanting to do it just to do it as an offering from PBM, as we view ourselves as this organization that's doing more of the avant-garde kind of stuff. At least that's how I like to, especially with the lab project, showing people the chance, or the first time to show people one of these trees in that type of setting. It's been on view here at the museum, but we haven't taken it to a large other exhibition like that. And so having this large hanging sculpture, paper sculpture that was 15 feet tall by 6 feet wide, and some of the photos of it online, allowing the light to pass through it, because it wasn't my exhibition, I was limited in where I could put it. And so ideally I would have picked a different spot for it in the show itself. But of the 2 options I was presented, I think I chose the one that gave more actual physical space so people could walk around it and it could kind of exist in its own area. Unfortunately though, that caused to put the sun behind it, which still worked, but when you were sitting there and trying to take a picture, backlit, it was more of a challenge to photograph it. But I think too maybe the challenge, or maybe what I was hoping that would force people to appreciate it, with their own eyes, and just you were there seeing it rather than having to get a photo to post online or whatever. It became more of a momentary experience because of how the light was tracking through the space, much like here at the museum, how we have the sun that tracks at different points in time, the shadow and light interplay and changes. That same effect was happening in the expo, and this was also, reacting, or I should say, the light was moving across it as well. So, it wasn't the most ideal location, but I think given our option, it worked out well. So that was my personal critique would be the lighting was less than ideal to really make this stand out as much as it could have, but I think it was the best that we could have done, kind of given the constraints of the options that I had. So, do you have any critiques or anything you would like to have done differently, or anything that you're...
As a glass artist, we're always, I can tell you everything that's wrong with everything I've ever made. I've really tried to reel that in from the past, last half of my career. I think we underestimated the scale of the glass. We didn't realize that until we were in the moment making it. And it was like, oh, this is big, but it's not big enough. It's kind of the feeling I have. I could have made the mold better to get a better effect with the bulging glass. This is all technical stuff, though. So
I think that's where the idea of experimentation also can't be understated, right? This wasn't something that had never been done before, nor could we ever knew if it was even going to work to begin with, right? And so I think that's the value of the lab project as a whole, just for us to experiment with. That's what it was designed to do, or meant to do, is to provide an opportunity to try things that you just don't know how they're going to turn out. And I don't know, at least in bonsai display, right? I think we're moving more towards the realm of people wanting to experiment and want to play and want to be more creative. And I think we as an organization, and specifically through the lab project, have helped to cultivate and encourage people to think outside the box a little bit. And I think a lot of people who if they didn't like it, I didn't necessarily hear about it. So that's usually the case. But there were far more people that came up to me and said how much this, how impressed they were, or just how much they enjoyed this than didn't. And so I think the overall majority, overall response was one that people were really impressed with it. And I think too, it also takes some time for the general bonsai population of practitioners to be able to get more comfortable with seeing things like this too, because you kind of know when you're expecting to see things, and when it doesn't fit that mold, there's maybe maybe at least give people pause to think about things a little bit more than writing it off. So, any questions? I want to kind of open that up to feedback. Yeah, wait.
So it's a beautiful piece of art. Are you gonna exhibit it outside?
Yeah, so the plan is for it to exist as much as we can like this outside. That would be the goal. So yeah, I would like to, when we have it on display, this is how it would exist in the museum for sure.
And the glass.
Yeah, and the glass, yeah. I don't know if it's gonna, we wouldn't have it in the wintertime because that's probably, right, I would imagine freeze thaw, or what are your thoughts on durability of it? Yeah, as long as someone doesn't take a rock and throw it at it, we can't protect against visitor interaction. But as far as the tree existing outside with that, which would be a whole other component to see the water actually coming and then going over the bubble itself as you physically water it. It might get a little funky underneath it if we leave it too long. So, but again, that's the experiment of what does it look like to care for this outside? We'll find out. So I think ideally this would be part of next year's special exhibition. This year we did retrospective on David Road, and so kind of with this piece and some of the other things we got working on, a few other projects, like this here in the collection, and then also looking around the region, to kind of do a special exhibition where we're looking at like the avant-garde bonsai. Michael Hagedorn had a really amazing piece there. He's been playing around with these floating trees, basically things that are hanging off the wall. Ryan has a few pieces that are interesting. So the idea is to do a special exhibition where we're looking at the avant-garde, which I'm calling avant-garde. And so it's kind of this idea of taking like some of our Nick Lynn's trees, who really kind of pioneered this whole idea of these really weird, quirky, non-traditional artistic things, which we have in our collection, and then also showcasing some of like what's the more contemporary bonsai kind of that are falling into this realm that are not quite the traditional vein. So at least that's the plan for now, is to do this kind of avant-garde focused special exhibition in the middle for next year. And this would be in for sure. Yeah. Oh, sorry.
Have you thought about getting glass pots where people can see lineage?
Yeah, I mean, we've ran through the gamut of it, so I think this is just the first step, right? I mean, we were talking about glass pots, we're talking about glass objects like within the tree, on the tree, hanging from the tree. I mean, you call over there on the pot, on the side of the pot. I mean, we were kind of just brainstorming because glass is such a malleable material. While it's hot, you can get these really interesting organic shapes to it, where you could have it, custom sort of fitted to a tree, and it's actually engaging with the physical tree itself, not just as almost an accent plant or an accent. I mean, really, what if you can almost think if you're thinking about this from a traditional 3-point display, right? From our expo, we had this massive scroll, more or less, this gigantic hanging piece of art, and that's essentially a glass accent piece, but it's just underneath the pot, right? I mean, that's at least how I think of it, is that we've just basically put everything in more of a linear orientation and kind of spreading them out in the triangular format if you wanted to kind of approach it more from that. Even just saying that, it's hard to get away from the 3-point display model, right? It almost feels like subconsciously I have to have a scroll and an accent and a tree, even though they're so different in material or form, that they were still there in some way. It's just another interpretation of that, a little less direct, but still there. And so I'm wondering, can you break away from that at some point? And I'm really cognizant of feeling that need to have those three elements represented, even if they're very, very non-traditional. They still kind of were there. Kathy, you had a question?
I just heard he was going to be up for the solstice event.
Yeah, so at least for this one, I'm planning. The goal is to keep this here through the solstice this year. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. We won't have to pull it off the water, but yeah, we'll do that. Yeah.
Each of the pieces that the stand, the tree, is plate that here to this level. They're all separate.
Correct.
So there isn't any reason that they need to be in a static relationship during any part of the season. In fact, all of these pieces will drop from each other.
They could, yeah, absolutely.
The bubble does go with the stand, right? We made the bubble, actually made a mold of the stand that we blew into. So if we take the stand off, you'll see indentations where the legs go.
Oh.
So it's not just a round bubble. That
I
actually,
see the indentation.
yeah, the idea
that.
is that the bubbles blow out of the void under the table.
Yeah.
And
So-
fill
Yeah.
that area.
And so that is, because I know about glass rolling, I had a friend who was a glass artist, and so I witnessed it many times. One of the things that you didn't mention is that the enormous nature of this bubble, but the team that works this glass is like they're dancing. If
Yeah.
you step back again and again and you watch that team work, it's too loud in the furnace area to speak. So they have communication that they do because they know the process so well, you could see them do it.
We're usually talking about what we're gonna have for dinner.
But
With an
because-
occasional like
Yeah, because
blow,
of
stop blowing.
they've
Let's
worked
heat it
together
up.
so
Yeah.
long.
Yeah.
And then one of the things that came to my mind when I was hearing you speak is that and as I watched a lot of glassblowing, is the extreme grace and strength of the artist as they move. The performance art to glassblowing is worth the look of what in there. But then that reminded me of this tree, because this tree is so enormous. It takes grace and strength and coordination and knowledge to do every part of the creation of this tree. This pot is also very difficult to make in the same way as the glass and the tree. And all of that is years worth of knowledge. And so that kind of dance and in so many different media, so many different spaces that came here for this.
Absolutely. I mean, you bring up a good point with Aarin and I have spoken extensively about some of the parallels between the bonsai culture and community, the glassblow art culture and community, all to little things like specialized tools. Like bonsai people get all crazy about their tools. Glassblowers are the same way. And then you're talking about the handling something that's very heavy but very fragile and awkward. That's bonsai, that's glassblow. And then just the history of how the art forms were brought to the United States. Bonsai coming from China, Japan, and having, the glassblowing world, we have our John Naka, who was he's Italian. His name's Lino. And he came over and he taught all the hippie American glassblowers how to actually blow glass for real. Not just making little goopy, drippy things, but being in control of precision glassblowing. So yeah, it's interesting to see those parallels and the learning curve, the amount of information, how the information is learned, with the language barriers. We talk about, if you go study in Japan, like your teacher isn't necessarily going to tell you why everything's done. You have to figure it out. You have to steal with your eyes. So you have to watch and watch. Same way with glassblowing. Maestro doesn't always speak English, so you got to watch what he does and figure out why did he do it that way. Yeah, and then grow from that. Techniques and growing processes. For me, it's super interesting to see these two worlds parallel. And the glass world really peaked in the 80s and 90s with Dale Julie and this whole Seattle glass scene. It kind of started to peter off a little, but I am seeing those parallels in the bonsai world in the American movement now. It's on this upside. It's more interest, it's more people. We have more people showing up here, more interesting displays. Americans that went over to Japan and learned, they're starting to shake off that Japanese influence and starting to find their own voice. So yeah, it's really interesting to compare the two. And also the discussion of art versus craft. So every art form, I think, has had this debate. What is art? What is craft? Everybody wants to be an artist. What is art? What is craft? And, is art better than craft, or is it just different? It's all valid discussions. It's been really interesting working with them. I've probably had more in-depth discussions about art in the 2 years I've worked here than in my 20 years working in the arts.
What I think another interesting thing that you kind of touched on too is like there's a lot of traditional, like there's a tradition, right? This idea of it being a traditional practice, and then also this idea of where does that, the interest move away from tradition to more of an expression of the individual and a lot of the modernity of that, art form evolving, right? And that kind of clash of traditionalists and contemporaries or whatever you would call it. Again, is kind of another thing that you touched on in terms of the similarity. Yeah.
So I'm way in the middle of this room, and there's been a lot of interest from younger people to kind of get into this craft. But just as you said, it's been very strictly like having it stored and having it like conditions like this where some people fuss it or why is it in this kind of pot or why is it, all those little things, and like with our generation kind of breaking barriers to say. So, I'm a jewelry designer, and I was just explaining to you how this is very alive to what I do too. Like that, she's saying that's knowledge that is passed down from generations, the materials, the delicate, processes, the precision, all of that. And I feel like we just need to encourage more young people to come here. Like I personally invite everyone that I can, but I just feel like doing this, it's really going to attract more people of the newer generation. And like the hanging bonsai, that was very viral. It was a viral moment. I saw it on a lot of like random blogs and Gen Z people talking about it, and it's a lot of interest. So this is definitely going to be a big plus in like catching more people to get interested in this.
Yeah. I mean, I couldn't agree more, and I think that's really great that you're. It's one thing for us to think these things and then to assume that happens, but then for feedback, that's really great to know your perspective on that. And I think the more I'm gonna say, I don't want to say it's like we're not trying to get rid of and not acknowledge like the origins of bonsai or the role that just learning a craft has. You have to know the basics in order to do that, but also provide an opportunity for people to see other things that maybe are not just what they kind of assume they're going to see at a bonsai museum, that it's only this type of thing. And so, so the hope, is to provide more opportunities for these new ways of showcasing trees with different materials or different styles that might appeal to a broader audience. Because I think that's definitely something we, as a Bonsai Museum, are focused at. But that is our really large part of our mission, is to provide more pathways for people to come and appreciate bonsai rather than it just having to be one. There's only one way to enjoy this, right? It has to. You have to know, how to appreciate it before you can. And so, doing more things that kind of move away from that, open the door for more ways for people to come at it. So, any other questions for anything pertaining to the lab or the expo? Or I know there were a few people that were there who attended it. I don't know if you guys wanted to say anything, but we want to spot. Otherwise, we can wrap it up for now.
Just say congrats.
Just thanks to Courtney and